Hey there, it's Rachel Mullins, the host of Hashtag No Filter Fridays on Public House Media.
Strike three, you're out.
Once again, welcome back to the Caught Listening podcast, presented by Public House Media. You can catch us wherever you get your podcasts on Google and Apple Play, as well as on Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, iHeartRadio, and of course, you can find us on publichousemedia.org. This is the baseball podcast that goes beyond the foul lines, and a little bit of a somber episode today, but kind of a celebration as well. The baseball world lost one of its greats earlier this year in Mr. Tiger, Al Kaline, the 18-time All-Star, the Hall of Famer, the man who, of course, his nickname bears a franchise in Mr. Tiger, one of the greatest hitters, one of the greatest players, one of the greatest men probably baseball has ever seen. And to help us talk about him, celebrate the life of him, is MLB.com Detroit Tigers beat writer Jason Beck. Jason, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
And real quick, I mean, a lot of people, a lot of kids today in baseball, you know, it's a sport that is so much latching onto its history and so much celebrates its history, but despite that, there are still some legends that maybe, unless you're a fan of that franchise, maybe you don't know or understand their impact. So for those non-Tiger fans, what does Al Kaline mean to the sport of baseball?
I mean, I guess the best way I can put it for people who weren't around him and don't remember his playing days is Al Kaline, this was before the days of the draft, so you could sign guys as soon as they graduate from high school. Al Kaline signed the day after his high school graduation, and when you signed for a certain bonus, you had to go straight to the major leagues for at least a couple of years. You couldn't spend any time in the minor leagues. So he signs with the Tigers the day after his high school graduation. A week or so later, he's with the Detroit Tigers, makes his major league debut at 18. He spent the rest of his life with or around the Tigers, working for that organization. So we're talking 67, maybe even this would have been his 68th year. So think about that, not just in sports, but even in life. Who does that?
Yeah.
It's just an incredible feat. And so when people say he's Mr. Tiger, when GM Al Avila calls him, the father or grandfather of the organization, he was the Tigers in a very real sense. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't just around, he was very active with the organization long after his playing days are done. First, for a quarter century as a broadcaster, and then as a very influential member of the front office.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've been reading a lot of your stuff, and when you talk about, General Manager Avila saying that, the father of the organization, it goes to more than just the numbers, just the stats of what he really meant to the Tigers franchise in terms of how much he was wanting to give back. Because it wasn't as if, we look at some of these legends and the hometown kids, like, for instance, how much Cal Ripken in 40, 50 years will be remembered for that because he was born just outside of Baltimore. It's not as if Al was born outside of Detroit. He was from Baltimore, ended up coming there, and like you said, spent the better part of 7 decades, with that organization as a human being, as a man. What was he like to be around, and what was he like to the organization?
He wasn't a very public guy, which is kind of interesting considering how public of a figure he was. He liked to listen more than he liked to talk. He didn't make his presence heavily felt. He liked to be there. He liked to observe. He had thoughts, but he tended to keep his private life private. And for me, I came onto the Tigers beat in 2002. it took a few years before I was able to really kind of, have good conversations with Al, because first of all, you felt kind of humbled in his presence. And mind you, I wasn't somebody who grew up in Michigan. I actually grew up in Pennsylvania, a Pirates fan. But the more you knew and learned about Al Kaline, and not just the numbers and the accomplishments in the career, but the way he carried himself, there was a grace to Al Kaline. You could tell long after his playing days are done, he was a great athlete. He's just one of those guys where, you just know the way they move, the way they carry themselves, everything is composed, calm. You could tell he was an accomplished athlete during his time, but he didn't like to brag about his stats. And he didn't, he felt almost embarrassed at times when he brought up his stats around him, but he felt like he could help younger players, and he felt like he could help the next generation, not just the next generation after him, but the generation after that, and after that, and after that. He was helping guys, the last couple of years who were 60 years separated from him in age, which is incredible. And they still gave him an incredible amount of respect, and they wanted his opinion, which is amazing to me.
The numbers do speak for themselves. I mean, 3,000 hits. He was 1 home run shy of 400. He was a career .297 batting average. 18 All-Star games, 16 of them in a row from 55 to 67. And then, of course, the 10-time Gold Glove Award, the World Series championship in 68, the Hall of Fame, all that stuff. But it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because that's almost reminiscent of the era, and he kind of was at the tail end of that era or I shouldn't say the tail end of that era, but maybe he was with that group where it wasn't necessarily really about their accomplishments, and he kind of left, his last game being in the early 70s in 74, where this era of superstars started to kind of really show up, and then you get into the 80s and free agency and all that other stuff, and them kind of taking on a life of their own. It almost kind of embodied the era with which he was in, and knowing where he came from and how much it took to actually get to where he was.
Yeah, when he came up, Ted Williams was still active, I believe. So, he was one of Ted Williams' favorite players. And Ted Williams loved Hank Greenberg before that. Yeah. And then now you go forward, as Al Kaline is finishing up, that is just before we get to the era of Alan Trammell and Lance Parrish and Jack Morris. So, just the times he witnessed, the DH had just come in. Yeah. We were about to get into the era of free agency. Just what he saw during his time playing is amazing. And he helped bridge that gap for Detroit. What he saw in Detroit is incredible. You consider what the city went through, both with the upswing after World War II and then the tough times in the 60s and early 70s. He became kind of the heart and soul of Detroit. Him and Willie Horton. It really was incredible. But, when you talk about his playing career, I really believe that if some of the advanced metrics we had today were around back then, he would have gotten a lot more attention, because when you go on Baseball Reference or Fangraphs and you look at some of these numbers, they would have been very kind to Al Kaline and would have given you a lot better glimpse into really how good of a hitter he was and really how good of an overall player. Because offense and defense, people rave about the type of arm he had. And then when you look at the walk and strikeout numbers, he was a really tough at-bat for a really long time, well into his 30s. He really was tough to strike out. And, I believe during his 4 years, he ended up with more, right around like an even ratio of walks to strikeouts. And incredibly enough, I looked it up the other day, he ended up with a higher overall batting average, and he had a batting average on balls in play, which is not easy to do. there's less than a dozen guys with 10,000 at-bats in the Hall of Fame who are able to do that for the course of their careers. What it means is you're able to hit for a lot of power, but you also struck out very rarely.
Yeah.
And that epitomized Al Kaline. And you won't see that again just because of the nature of the way the game is nowadays.
Well, and that's all, one of the great things, and one of the ways that, numbers in baseball in particular, the stats are what help kind of compare across eras. And you've got a great piece on MLB.com, Al Kaline, one of MLB's toughest at-bats. And you're talking about batting average on balls in play. He's third in Tiger history behind Hank Greenberg and Alan Trammell. That 1954 year, he's third best single season in Tiger's history. But over the course of his career and across Major League Baseball, you highlighted in here, among Hall of Famers with at least 10,000 plate appearances since 1900, only 10 are better than Al Kaline's 296 batting average with balls in play. And among those names, Ted Williams, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Mel Ott, Babe Ruth, Ernie Banks, Honus Wagner, Stan Musial. I mean, there are legends of the game that he is in company with.
Yeah, and our StatCast people had great stats. I believe it was yesterday or today, where if you look at career right fielders who played, at least half their games in right field, Al Kaline is fourth in terms of wins above replacement, according to Baseball Reference. He's just behind Roberto Clemente. Hank Aaron's at the top. He's ahead of Reggie Jackson, Larry Walker, Paul Wainer, Tony Gwynn. It's amazing what he was able to do. I almost wish that we could have gotten some of these advanced metrics, not just in terms of ROAR and these, but even just some of the TrackMan stuff in terms of exit velocity and sprint speed, because in his prime, Al Kaline could do it all. Arm strength. You wish you could have gotten some of this stuff on him because he was a tremendous athlete in his prime. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and you chronicle it in a lot of what he meant on the field, off the field, all of that stuff. One of the things that I think is so intriguing, that's just incredible, because today's game has shifted so much to an all or nothing, strikeout or home run type hitters is what we're seeing. And it's what makes guys like Mike Trout so rare in today's game. But Al, even in an era where pitching dominated, or in an era where everybody was trying to hit for average and for power and all of that stuff, and there weren't a lot of strikeouts, he was still the cream of the crop in that 1955, when he was the youngest batting champion in the American League, he had 8 home runs with runners in scoring position and only 9 strikeouts with runners in scoring position. You'll have games now where there are 9 strikeouts with runners in scoring position from a single team.
Oh, yeah. It's like the numbers, looking up the splits and I was amazed that Baseball Reference had these.
Yeah.
It was like a 28-9 walk to strikeout ratio with runners in scoring position for him. And it's not like they were all intentional walks. In fact, very few of them were.
Right.
But I think even beyond that, I don't know if I included it, but he had like 6 sacrifice flies in there, at least 6, maybe even more. He was just such a tough at bat, and he got tougher as the situation got bigger. He didn't shy away from the big at bats, and you consider how good of a hitter he was, even into his 30s. That at age 33 in 1968, he was so important to that 68 team that they moved their center fielder to shortstop, that they could get Al Kaline in the lineup for the World Series.
Right.
For the World Series.
When he had a broken bone in his wrist or something too earlier that year, if I remember correctly.
Yes, absolutely. In 1954, his first full season in the big leagues, at age 9, he was a teenager.
Yeah.
At age 19, and he put up this tremendous streak without striking out. I think it was like 70-some at-bats. That's amazing for a teenager in the major leagues to be doing that. And that was the year before he won the batting title at age 20.
Right. And that was the year he finished third in Rookie of the Year voting to Bob Grimm of the New York Yankees, who went 20-6 as a pitcher with a 3.26 ERA. So, just incredible and impressive. We're talking with Jason Beck, a MajorLeagueBaseball.com Tigers beat writer here about the life and legacy of Al Kaline. And I want to kind of go back to that 68 World Series because you lead off your piece about him as one of the toughest hitters, reminiscing from 2008 when the Tigers celebrated the 50th anniversary of that 68 World Series championship. And he talked so much about saying it was an honor to play on that team and what they did. We were just talking about it, but to get him into the lineup, and it's so impressive. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the start and about what his demeanor was like and his personality was like. And that was just to even being one of the greatest, if not the greatest Detroit Tiger of all time, to be honored to be on that World Series team and what they were willing to do to put him in that lineup.
Yeah, it was a couple years ago. I wrote about it, because the anniversary was 2018, and I must have talked with him for 10, 15 minutes about his memories of that, and it was all about his teammates. I don't know if he said a word about anything he did in that World Series other than being hurt and coming back. He talked about the sacrifice that Mickey Stanley made to move from center field to shortstop and how nervous Mickey was about making a mistake that might cost him a game. But he also talked about how much he loved and respected Bill Freehan and how he felt like Bill Freehan has a case to be in the Hall of Fame. He talked about how clutch of a pitcher Mickey Lolich was. He talked about all these guys and almost nothing about himself. And that really typified the Al Kaline that I got to know. He wanted to talk more about other people. He didn't want to talk about his own accomplishments. He really didn't. You had to talk to other guys about what Al Kaline was about. And that kept coming out about, and I kept, as I've written stories about him in the days since his passing, a lot of the quotes are of teammates and contemporaries talking about Al Kaline, not about Al talking about himself. Yeah. Because it was tough for him to do that.
And especially in a World Series where he hit 379 with 2 homers and 8 RBIs, and was a very integral part of that rally for Detroit, who came back from down 3-1 to win the World Series there in 1968. Very few people, when you talk nicknames, very few are of the franchise that they represent. Obviously one that comes to mind is of course Ernie Banks and Mr. Cub, but what about Al Kaline epitomizes the Detroit Tigers organization and earns him that moniker of Mr. Tiger?
I think it's a combination of longevity, long-time greatness, grace, and humility. Because, mind you, I didn't grow up a Tigers fan. I grew up a Pirates fan because I grew up in Pennsylvania. But in my, I guess this is my 19th year covering Tigers, the guys I think of when I think about the Tigers are Al Kaline, Bernie Harwell, and Alan Trammell. And those 3 guys, I think, really epitomize those qualities. They not only stuck around a long time, they bridged generations and they earned respect, but they also carried themselves with such an incredible amount of class and such an unselfish quality, all of them. And I just don't know how many other organizations have that. I think you can include Willie Horton in that group too. He still does a ton of stuff in the community of Detroit. And, he had a street named after him, I think just last year, the year before, up here. But, just And I think when you find those qualities in so many guys from an organization, that reflects so greatly on the ball club. And I think the Tigers and Detroit are very lucky to have had guys like that in the organization. And when you talking with Trammell, he said that he watched the way Al Kaline carried himself. Mm-hmm. Granted, Al had retired by the time Tram was drafted, let alone came up, but he was around the club a lot in his broadcasting role. And Tram said that he watched the way he talked, how he spoke, what he talked about. And when you talk and have a conversation with Trammell, when you watch the way Trammell carries himself, it makes a ton of sense because you see a lot of those same qualities. And I think being able to pass that down from generation to generation says a lot about what Al Kaline was about.
Is there a contemporary player, a current person in the major leagues that, maybe kind of you could best compare their abilities on the field to Al Kaline?
Abilities on the field. Wow. That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that. Man. There were some Mike Trout qualities to him. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he could run the same way as Mike
It's the
Trout,
only person I can think of.
The multifaceted, yeah. Among the guys that I've had the privilege of covering, I think, maybe there's some Curtis Granderson had some of those qualities, although Curtis played center in Detroit. And I think really the overall skill set and the way they carried themselves, I think Curtis, there's a lot of Curtis that reminds me of Al Kaline. Really does. Just overall, the game, the way he carries himself, the way he looks to give back, the way he helps out the younger generation. I think there's a lot that carries over. So I think that's one comparison I could make. I think trying to think who else. I think that's a good one. I think Nick Castellanos had some of those qualities too. I think it took a while for those to come out.
It's just so tough to, because again, it was a different era where it wasn't so much swinging for the fences or striking out. It was putting balls in play. It was moving runners over. It was contributing in other ways. And so I think the guys that you've named, make perfect sense when you think about it. And it might be tough for some people. There's video, but it's tough to go back and really kind of picture it here. I hate to speak in this kind of terms about something, about someone's passing, but this would have been the second full week of the Major League Baseball season had it not been for the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know you've been in contact with members of the Tigers organization in terms of how they're planning to celebrate Al Kaline's memory once we are able to play baseball and there are able to be games in Detroit again. But I almost feel as though we wouldn't be able to have these kind of conversations if we were in the midst of a baseball season right at the start of the year.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I hope that somehow we're able to get games in Detroit, because it would be a shame if we're not able to celebrate Al Kaline's life at the ballpark. Mm-hmm. I think back to when Ernie Harwell passed away. They actually had a public viewing at Comerica Park. It wasn't a game day. It was I believe it was an off day for the team. And I covered that, and I'll never forget the lines of people that wanted to show up and pay their respects to Ernie. And, they wrapped around the corners. They almost wrapped around the ballpark, I believe, at one point. And these were people who may have never had a chance to speak to Ernie Harwell in their lives, but they felt like that Ernie was a part of their lives from watching and listening to him for all those years. And I wish there would have been a chance to do that for Al Kaline. and to allow people to kind of pay their respects and their thanks and kind of have that connection. And it's too bad. But if we could at least get a game, a day to celebrate his memory at the ballpark, like they were able to do for Ernie, like for Sparky Anderson, like for Mike Ilitch, that would mean so much. It really would.
We're talking with Jason Beck, a Detroit Tigers beat writer for MLB.com, and remembering Al Kaline. Jason, every week we take questions from some fans, and we play a little game called Pepper, where you and I just kind of give a little quick hitter answer here to the question that is posed by our fans. And again, you can submit your questions every single week on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Go just search Caught Listening by Public House Media, or email the show caughtlisteningphm@gmail.com. Got two quick ones here for you, Jason. Are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
All right, first one here comes from David, who, since Mr. Tiger, and of course Al, was the first Tiger to have his number retired, who's going to be the next Detroit Tiger?
It's funny you mention that, because I actually have a piece about that up on MLB.com. I think player-wise, it's going to probably depend on who retires first, whether it's Justin Verlander or Miguel Cabrera. Mm-hmm. I think those are the most likely guys. Now, mind you, Lou Whitaker is going to have his number retired at some point this year, whenever we're able to resume baseball. Right. Lou is already next up. They've already announced that, so I'm not counting that.
Okay.
But once you get past that, you're probably looking at Verlander or Cabrera. There's a chance maybe Jim Leland gets his number retired. That depends on, in a couple of years, if the today's game committee for the Hall of Fame puts him in as a manager.
Yeah, he was my thought was maybe Jim Leland gets it next based on what he did. But then I think, out of those two players, I think it'd probably end up being Cabrera. But I know his contract's for another 3 or 4 years or something like that. So who knows on those guys. All right, and then last one here. This one's kind of funny actually, because I had to look up the numbers when I got this. But Eric is wondering, is Yogi Berra winning the MVP over Al Kaline in 1955 one of the biggest robberies in sports? I had to look up the numbers on this. I
think so, actually. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree 100%. How a guy... So Yogi Berra's numbers, he slashed 272, 349, and 470 that year. Al slashed 340, 421, and 546, played in every single game, had 53 more hits, 37 more runs, 22 more walks, had 6 fewer RBIs and the same number of home runs. So I don't understand how Al Kaline did not win the MVP in 1955.
It really is incredible how that happened. You wish that, if the award voting had the visibility then mm-hmm. that it does now, and if we had some of those metrics then that we do now, you wonder what, if the vote would have been similar and what the outcry would have been at the time. I would have loved to have heard it.
Yeah. I mean, Ted Williams hit 356 and finished fourth in that year, and Mickey Mantle had 99 RBIs and 37 home runs, hit 306, 30 points better than his teammate, and finished fifth. So I have no idea what they were thinking in 1955. But
I think that was one of those eras where I think back then, talking to people, there was a lot of credence given to did your team win the league, and sometimes the perceived best player from the winning team was that was the player who got it, rightly or wrongly. And I think that's, over the years, that thought process has changed. Certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, I think there's been a big shift in the opinions about that, as we've seen more and more metrics, and we've seen wins above replacement take some prominence.
100%. Jason, we appreciate the time so much in remembering the life and legacy of Mr. Tiger, Al Kaline. Before I let you go, first off, Howard, I know that these are crazy times, and it's very strange. We don't think to ask this enough of people when they come on shows and whatnot, but how are you with all of this? You, your family, the folks that you're around, how are you all doing in this as we continue through this pandemic?
I'm healthy. I'm staying safe. I don't get out a lot, for better or for worse. And I don't want to, make too much light from that because Detroit's going through really tough times with this right now. Detroit area has been one of the hardest hit, not just the city, but in some of the suburbs too, have really been taking this hard. But, I've been safe. I go out to run to get my exercise in because I'm a big runner. I go to grab groceries once a week or so, and I go to, grab carry out once or twice a week, and that's about it. I stay socially isolated, which, it helps when you're on the phone and on the computer and online and doing a lot of as much writing as you can about classic games and unfortunately friends that we lose and big figures that we lose. But I'm getting along, and my family's all fine too, including the family in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's great to hear, and I know you're keeping busy. You're doing a lot of stuff there with MLB.com. Let the folks know, especially our Tiger fans who are listening, how they can follow you along if they aren't already on social media.
Well, it's on social media. It's at Beck Jason, and on the traditional internet, it is MLB.com and Tigers.com.
Jason Beck, Detroit Tigers beat writer for MLB.com. We appreciate the time so much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. You stay safe as well.
Jason Beck, MLB.com, Detroit Tigers beat writer. Again, at Beck Jason, BeckJason on Twitter. And again, for those of you who didn't know about Al Kaline, and I'll be honest, I knew of him. I knew he was Mr. Tiger. I knew he played right field. I knew he was a Hall of Famer. But really diving into this and who he was as a person and as a player, it's unfortunate that, his passing is what led to all of that. So we appreciate the time from Jason to tell us the stories and the legacy of Mr. Tiger and what he means to that organization and to baseball as a whole. We thank you guys for being a part of the show as always. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share us with your friends and family, wherever you get your podcasts, and search for Caught Listening by Public House Media on all social media platforms. I'm Christian Heimel, and until next week, you have been caught listening.